Welcome to Voice of the Nation. I'm Chan Chai Wong. It is official now that Emmanuel Macron will serve his second term as the president of France after he won the election against Marine Le Pen. But there are many challenges await for him as France is now even more divided. What are some of the expectations that French people expect from Macron, and will he meet those expectations? Joining us today is Associate Professor Dr. Somchai Phakkapat an independent political scientist. Welcome to our program. You see the result of the election that Macron won by 58.5% to 41.5% of the vote. Do you think this was a satisfactory result for Macron?
I think he's satisfactory for a certain extent, but not fully satisfactory. You know why? If you look at the margin of the winning, is narrower than the previous one. The previous one, the gap is about 33 percentage point, but this time it's just about 18 to 19. That is one thing. That is mean that the challenge is greater. Secondly, if you look at the combination of the vote from the first round, there are, for example, for the far right, 32%, the highest in the history of the electoral history of France. Secondly, the Mélenchon, that is what we call the La France Insoumise, that is what we call a little bit far left. Altogether 22, altogether far right and far left is 52. All these four parties were against what we call the constitution, were against what we call the establishment. And counting, for example, about 27 abstention, it means that 3/4 of the population are not satisfied. So Macron is not really satisfied what is the result. Secondly, the victory of Macron is not attributed to what the people's preference for Macron, but a lot of people, I could see that a majority of the people elected Macron, we call in French vote utile, not preference for Macron, but against Le Pen. So he's not elected because of what he has already performed, but the majority want to avoid, for example, the victory of Le Pen. So these two factors altogether mean that Macron will win the next and govern the next 5 years with a lot of difficulty, because it means that a lot of French are not yet satisfied with his previous performance. Of course, I think at least 1/3 is satisfactory with Macron, but what about the 2/3 that is left to the performance of Macron in the future? One of the what direction that could dictate what will happen in the next 5 years is the coming assembly, the election of the Congress, the 12 and the 19. Does Macron could be ever to gather majority? If not, he will face a lot of problems. If in the case that the far left could gather enough vote in the assembly, there would be a lot of difficulty due to the phenomenon that has already been avoided, the so-far cohabitation. That is mean that two different ideological co-govern in France. So that is what we have to see. The next 2 months, what will happen, that would be dictate the future trend of Macron governance.
Okay. And for Le Pen, how do we pronounce her name correctly? Le Pen?
Le Pen?
Le Pen. Okay, and for Le Pen, even though she was defeated to Macron for a second time, she said that it was a brilliant victory for her. What do you think she meant that her defeat was a brilliant victory?
I think I do agree with her. Rassemblement National, in the past we call Front National, because of the image they changed in 1918 after the defeat in the previous into what we call a more nimble symbol of the Front National into Rassemblement. Okay, so
Yes.
she is satisfied. Why? Because if you look at his father's performance in 2002, his father, Jean Marie, has been defeated by Jacques Chirac by 60-point margin. You see the second term. And
Yes.
her previous defeat, how much more? 33. So with
Okay.
the margin of just only 19, she thinks that she has done quite a lot to heighten, for example, the popularity of her party. Secondly, if you look at her party performance, this time the first round, she gathered 23. That is the highest. And if you look at the second round, she gathered 41. Into incident that she gathered the highest point for the far right in the history of France. So that is what she said that if she is not defeated, she win, but only not to the point that she could become the president. But the history of the development is on her side. That is why some people say that in fact she is not defeated, but she win.
Okay. And if this trend keep going, maybe next election, the candidate from the far right party may won the presidency. If this trend
Well,
continues.
it is very difficult in a sense because if we define the far right of France, the typical far right, that is what we call with a platform against what we call a certain conscience of the French people. The first platform that threatened, for example, the French people, I mean the majority, is
Yes.
what we call against European Union. Though uh, Le Pen has uh, uh, weakened a certain, for example, a concept of what we call the joining of the EU. In the past, she said that she wants France to keep out of the Eurozone. But now he said that France will be part of the United, the European Union. But
Yes.
in detail, that is threatening the European Union because she wants to turn the supranational European Union into what we call Union des Nations. That is the union of nation state. That is what we call a backtracking to the period of the goal. So that is what we call demolishing what we call the identity. That is very important. Secondly, she want to pull France from what we call the supreme ally in Europe, the so-called SASR, from not pull out of membership of the NATO, but pull out of what we call the unified supreme command in the midst of what we call the conflict with Russia. So all these two platforms are quite threatening, and that's why a lot of friends, why were aligned with her in what we call the common problem, high hyperinflation, and also the diff- difference between rich and poor. But all these two are quite threatening. And lastly, he wanted to amend the constitution. That is what we call the coup d'etat, because he wanted to amend the constitution to the point of ripping off what we call the basic spirit of France. That is what we call the freedom that has already been inspired from the time of the French Revolution. So this is what they call that if she becomes a president, it means that she has already resort to what we call a coup d'etat without violence. That is what we call treating. So as far as the Rassemblement National uh, don't change all this threatening platform, it quite be difficult even in the future that uh, this far right could be gathering enough vote to become the president. But of course, Front National has already lessened her image to a certain point. That is why she become a little bit more attractive to the French people, uh, to what we call the common people problem, like what we call the inflation. That is the extraction of the French far right becoming a little bit more what we call vulnerable, weakening her rough image and threatening image. So it depends on the future. Will she change or amend a certain what you call the hard line and become a little bit more weakening or more acceptable for French people. It depends on what he will do in the future.
Okay, we see that both Macron and Le Pen try to reach out to the majority of French people, but the turnout at this election is only 72%, the lowest in many decades for France election. Why is that, and what does this mean to France politics?
Good. France and like any other country has been, for example, suffering from the phenomenon of globalization. Globalization leave a lot of what we call unemployment. That is one thing. Secondly, globalization has created what we call a digital divide, rich and poor. That is the second phenomenon challenge. And third, because of the personality of Macron, Macron is perceived as what we call the support of the rich and also her what we call arrogant gesture also alienate French people. So that is why Macron has not been elected by what we call French preference, but has been elected to avoid what we call the threatening far right. So Macron nearly perceived what happened. So in his victory speech, he said that, okay, I know that you does not or you do not elected me as you like, but try to avoid the other. So Macron want to change, for example, two things: his image and also a certain platform. Like what happened, he said that from now on he will be close to the people. He will develop a certain kind of what we call participatory democracy, or we call deliberative democracy. Will, for example, discuss with the people of all sort of a sector in a continuous manner. That's one thing that he tried to do. What he has already done after what we call the yellow card, remember yellow. So he wanted to make the same thing in order to lessen his image, what we call to a loop. Secondly, he has already changed a certain platform. For example, he has been criticized for extending the 65 year for the retirement, and people say that we want French people to work for the whole life. So he has already lessened a certain part of this platform and prolong it to longer. And secondly, will be compensated with higher pension. So these two things mean that Macron have to develop a certain platform that is more well that has already been criticized. So Macron will be successful or not depend on the two things. Macron could be successful in changing what we call a certain platform to be in accordance with what we call the majority of the people. And secondly, that is more difficult. Could he change the image? Because changing image is not one side. It must be perceived that. So you change, you say that you change, but people will not perceive that. So this is the more difficult Macron image that need to be done. So that is two things that Macron will uh, will be successful or not in the future, depending on what we call the platform in line with the majority, and secondly, the hard image, the image that some people say that he is one of the most detested president of the history. But that is, I think, it's not fair for Macron because quite a number of people like Macron in a sense, but he has been criticized by some part that he's the most detested president in France because of his aloof and arrogant gesture.
Okay. Some French people say that Macron was a president for rich people. Would you agree?
Uh, you why because of the image, because Macron is intelligent, capable. So he shows something, for example, when in the debate, the eye and something in the first, it signifies, and for some people say that, oh, you are just insulting on the other. So that is one thing because of his, for example, competency and also his intelligence. Secondly, because of the platform, in the first tenure in the mandate, he in fact has done quite good for the economy. Unemployment has already been declining, and secondly, the competitiveness of French economy is gaining momentum. One of the things is that he tried to attract more investment by lowering tax. Okay, so by lowering tax, Macron has been criticized that you are, supporter of the rich, but in fact, the lowering tax in with the aim of attracting more investment that is successful, but is perceived elsewhere because by doing so, Macron has been perceived that you are supporting the big entrepreneur and you are supporting the foreigner or something like that. So that is the image that derived from the platform. So mm, fair or not fair has been perceived because of that thing. But if we give a fair account, of course, image certainly yes, okay. But the platform, I think that if we look at what he has done, he has, for example, push France higher in terms of economic performance. And secondly, he put France higher in international and in European context. France under Macron is like the goal has been, for example, the what we call the leadership of the has already made France the leadership of what we call European Union alongside with Merkel or Germany. That is what the France is quite proud of what France has done because before the goal or after the goal, no French president has done so good in what we call the international politics uh, uh, with the what we call the performance so acceptable for in the international arena like Macron has done, both in European Union and also the world at large.
Okay. And Macron, who is only 44 years old, very young for a leader of a country, but surprisingly, he was not so popular among young voters, and his major supporters are actually senior citizens. Why Macron is more popular among senior citizens rather than young people?
Okay, if you look at the statistic, Macron is not popular among 25 to 59. Okay, as
Yeah,
you mentioned. Okay, okay, and he's more popular for those older and also younger. Okay, you know why? Because with the impact of the globalization, all these people have been suffering unemployment. Macron has faced what we call three threatening, what we call challenge. One is the COVID-19.
yes,
Secondly, Ukraine. And with the Ukraine, the inflation and the economy of all the nation has been declining. So all these things leave those who work, for example, unhappy because of the unemployment and because of the high inflation. So it is very understandable for thing. Secondly, maybe Macron has been criticized by having, for example, giving rise to a certain unemployment of some sector because Macron, like all the other, have to change what we call the economic model into what we call the IT and the technological platform. So those who work in the what we call uh, the revolution, the industrial revolution, has been left without job. So that is why in the suburb that one very popular in during the industrial revolution has already been, for example, empty. So all these people like the white guy in America that like Trump. So this is the second. And third, because of the Macron platform, try to lessen the importance of the so-called union, try to encourage, for example, more on the employer side. So all this also leave people, for example, the union and all the other suffering from what we call the bargaining strength. So all this all together make what happened feeling against Macron in this sense. And finally, no matter what happened, the digital divide has already divided between rich and poor. So in this sense, what happened? Macron also has been a victim of this phenomenon, like all any other country. So all these factors contribute to the problem that Macron suffer. But of course, some of the factors also make Macron unpopular. Like for example, extending the the pension, the retirement to 65, and France said that I don't want to work for the whole life. So all these
People
people
want to work
also
longer.
against that is that. And what makes Macron not popular? That is what we call the yellow. Remember, uh, Giro Chon, Gile Chon, because
Yes.
Macron want to protect the world because of the climate change. He want to change what we call to lessen the dependence on what the fossil. So by doing, he increased what we call the price of the energy. So that is create what we call the great unrest in the history of France with the zero zone altogether. So this is one of the factors that contribute to what Macron has been perceived as the most detested in the sense by or by the French. That is what happened to Macron. But if we look at what he has done, some of the factor has been, for example, of course, it's not done by Macron, but it's the trend. But some yes, but on the contrary, what he has done, something has only been good for France in what we call a broader term. If you look at what we call a sector by sector, of course, some sector has been suffering, and this sector are the sector that don't want Macron. That is what happened.
Now, talking about a divided country, Macron vowed to unite a divided France. How is France society divided? Is it like how Thailand divided between young generation and old generation, or between liberal free thinking and conservative nationalists? Is that
Okay,
how France is divided?
you know, in France we have what we call a real political party, but in Thailand we don't have a real political party. What I mean, when we define what we call interest group and political party in what we call academic term, interest group means a group of people with no what we call political ambition. They
Yes.
are not going to politics directly, but of course will have a certain implication on politics, you know. But political party are group of people with certain ideology. So in France we have what we call party socialist, party, for example, like communist,
Yes.
but Rassemblement National, far right, okay. But here in Thailand, we don't have that kind of thing. We are, uh, uh, our political party is the extension of what we call interest group. Okay, there
Okay.
is no what we call. So this same, in France, in the past, is divided in a sense between center right and center left. From 1958 with the constitution, the current one, until Macron, center right, like, of the goal, and now we call the Republican, and the center left party socialist has been alternating in governing of France until Macron. But now with Macron, the France is divided into what we call far right and center. So this is what we call ideological divide in a sense. But in Thailand, we don't have this kind of thing, you know. And one of the thing is very simple. If you look how to make what we call a platform together, now uh, uh, the far right and also the far left try to unite all the other in order to become what we call Melanchon, what we call a government with the president of Macron. They have to conciliate, compromise on what we call platform. So it is very difficult, okay? But in Thailand, if you want to create what we call a coalition, you just spend just about 10 minutes. Okay, you take this one ministry, I take this one. Because of the interest, So that is a lot of difference between what we call the division between political party in Thailand and in France. That is what I distinguish in France and all the other countries in Europe. we have what we call ideological party, strategic party. That is a party with what we call a permanent or long-term platform. But here in Thailand, we don't have ideological party. We don't have strategic party. We have only tactical party with the
Just a group
platform
of
changing
interest.
every time, according to what happened.
Okay, and what about the difference between rich and poor people, the gap between rich and poor people? Do they have that problem in France?
Oh, well, of course, like all the other country, old people now is getting older because of the life expectancy is longer. Like in Thailand, So
Yes,
Macron think that since the life is longer, why don't let people work
work
longer?
longer.
Because in a sense, I want to work longer, you know. But France's culture is a lot different because I've been studying France in Spain, A lot of
Yes,
people don't want to work too much, So that is a different culture, okay? But anyway, uh, old people in France, I think that should be very happy. If you look what happened, because the welfare system of France is quite good. Like in all the other, look at what is COVID. COVID, our country, we suffer a lot, lost poor people. But all these people, didn't suffer because the welfare system is good. But it
so
for the
they receive the compensation from
exactly
work.
okay. So but they don't. It's better in a sense. So in this sense, I think that old people in France, is you know living in what we call a welfare state that is quite satisfactory in a sense. But of course, because of the COVID, is quite violent and also a lot of what we call as consequence. So some people even getting what we call the welfare suffer to a certain limit because of the chain of everything. And what people suffer more, I think, is the effect of globalization. So this effect was already uh, happening everywhere. So I think that not only the old people, I think the whole sector of people more or less has been suffering for the better or suffering no to the better or to the worse. So a lot of people has been suffering on the what we call to the worst side. All these people is not only the old, even the young people that could not be adapted to what we call a world of what we call the fourth industrial revolution, the digital. So a lot of people have to change. That is why we have uh, uh, those what we call innovative disruption. Innovative disruption is mean that it's not disrupt only the enterprise, but disrupt how the way you work, how the way you think. So all these people affect all walk of life in France, not only the old people. That's why uh, those age between 25 to 59 said that they didn't vote for Macron because of the effect that I have already mentioned, the effect of what we call the uh, globalization. In France, we call mondialisation. That is what happened everywhere, not only in France.
And my last question, how do you see the future of France in the next 5 years? Do you expect any major change in society?
One worry me, not only France, but in all the other. The effect of globalization, the effect of what we call social media, has already made a lot of countries become polarized. You know, polarized means that not you and me, zero sum game. That is
Yes,
very dangerous because in so doing, it creates what we call illiberal democracy. That is what is happening in a lot of countries. For example, like you have already seen in Hungary, in Poland, in USA under Trump. That is one thing. The coming and the rise of illiberal, and also the decline of liberal democracy. So the rise of the far right, is a certain trend that should be uh, uh, kept in observation, keep in mind. That is one thing that is dangerous. Secondly, polarization is mean that it become more and more violent because by having polarization, there will not be what we call a certain what we call alternance between you and me. That is what we call not you or me. That is the second element of what we call very important, what we call the so-called the illiberal democracy. And lastly, illiberal democracy is also based on what we call the living of what we call the dignity of people. They try to, for example, violate what we call the freedom. So that is very dangerous in the world because during the Cold War, the ideological confrontation is between liberal democracy and communism. But nowadays, that is the confrontation between the same democracy, but liberal democracy, check and balance, and what we call illiberal democracy, democracy with what we call dictatorship in detail. So that is very dangerous. So what happened with the election is also show us that not only France, the whole world at large is also uh, uh, is changing in the future to the point that there could be what we call a polarization, not only limited in one country, polarization between those who want what we call freedom, liberty, liberal democracy, and those who just based on what we call the majority, but without freedom. That is what is going to happen, not only in France, but the world at large.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Somchai, for your time and talking with us today. And we'll wait and see what will happen in France for the next 5 years under the Macron second term presidency. Thank you. And that's all for Voice of the Nation. Thank you for staying with us.